Fergalicious? No, it's Meshlicious. Up dog? What's up dog?
Behold.
Meshlicious. Wow. That's pretty swanky. Now this is a mini ITX case, if that wasn't obvious. It's 14.67 liters. It's highly configurable on the inside. You know, the full GPU length that could support up to 320 millimeters. The overall dimensions is 245 millimeters by 165.5 millimeters by 360 millimeters. So you can put a radiator in here, but the internals are reconfigurable a little bit depending on what you want to do. So if you look at the rear I/O here, you may think, oh, you know, I can't have a GPU any longer than the case. Well, that's not true. You can actually mount the GPU vertically, and the cables can be managed out the bottom through this. So you could have the GPU mounted vertically or horizontally, depending on what you want to do. If you do have a smaller GPU, then that leaves a lot of room down here for drives or more radiator or whatever. If you do use a no GPU or a shorter GPU system, maybe you're looking at using this as the most ridiculous home server ever, you can put a bunch of 2.5 or 3.5 inch hard drives in with this bracket, or you would normally have your vertical GPU. But if you do the horizontal GPU up here, or you elect not to have a GPU, well, that's a fair bit of room for drives. 2 3.5 inch drives is no problem. 4 2.5 inch drives is also no problem. If you get creative, you can get even more in there, especially if you're not gonna have a GPU. Get 3D printing. Now you're looking at the back here and you're saying, okay, a 3-slot GPU, that's no problem, but what about a 4-slot GPU? You can actually move the whole motherboard tray this way a little bit. See this thing here? You'll get a little bit less clearance on the motherboard side, but you actually end up moving the motherboard a little bit this way so that you do have room to put a vertical, 4-slot graphics card if you want. I'm not going to do that, but you do have the option. Toolless, I like it. So that's what this standoff is. You can, set that up here and move the whole motherboard tray up a little bit to get a little bit more room on the back. You can kind of see this whole thing will lift up. So a little less more motherboard clearance for more GPU clearance. I like the flexibility. Depending on what your goals are, you can have the SFXL power supply or the SFX power supply. You can see that, one of them is a little longer than the other one. Generally, the SFXL power supplies are a little cheaper. I mean, they're the same footprint on the outside, they're just a little bit deeper. So, this case doesn't really care. So you can see, even with an SFXL power supply, you've got plenty of room, even if you're gonna run a front radiator with plenty of fans. I mean, you got all that room, have even more room with a smaller power supply. So, it's really your call on what's available. Now, in case you're wondering about this cutout on the back, yes, you can use a regular ATX power supply with this as well. I'm going to use an SFX power supply just so I've got a little bit more wiggle room, I think. But you could use an ATX power supply with this if you want, but I think it's going to make the front a little crowded, especially if you're using a radiator. So I'm going to try to put a 240 in here. We'll see how that goes. These front brackets are adjustable that your thing screws into, so you can slide this up and down depending on where your tubes are, because here the clearance might be difficult. Maybe it has to come off on the bottom. Tubes on the bottom maybe is a better idea anyway. So you got options. Power supply. I highly recommend a small form factor power supply, but the global situation being what it is, I was able to pick up a CX750. It's probably old stock, but it's gonna work fine for this build. Note also, I'd recommend that you go ahead and install your CPU, but again, global situation what it is, yeah. Small form factor, SFX, SFXL, regular ATX, Meshlicious don't care. Now remember, the whole motherboard tray could move up if you want, for even more room for your GPU. For the cooling, I decided to use a Fractal Celsius S240, mainly because it's pretty decent for this type of cooling task, and because all its cables are built in. So there's not really a lot of permutations where the radiator fits. It'll either, sort of bang against the power supply cable at the top, or you can't put it all the way at the top with the tubes up, and tubes down would be a little better anyway, but then this giant power supply kind of gets in the way, so you'd be better off using a smaller power supply. Fortunately, the bracket is reversible and slidable, so if you're dealing with a 240 millimeter cooler versus a 280 millimeter cooler, you get a little bit more mounting flexibility. And because we're talking about an i5 here, I mean, really, yes, with these 11th gen i5s, I would much rather have the 280 millimeter radiator, but i5, it's probably okay. I'm not gonna do the multi-core enhancement overclock, but I'm not gonna really push it. So I'm gonna try that and see if we can keep up. Probably gonna need a negative AVX offset. You just flip the bracket. Seems like that's going to work reasonably okay. And I'm probably going to be able to use the fractal fans. Now, something that you might not realize about fans when you do a build like this, sometimes I'll put it together, and because the fans are in a pull configuration, you'll hear like a weird grinding sound. If you look at how it goes up and down, like I can pull on it a little bit, when this thing is spinning really fast, it'll lift on its hub, and that may push the fan into your radiator. These radiators have a lot of clearance, so it's probably not going to happen, and you can always upgrade to really, really tight engineering tolerances. These slim Noctua fans are great for builds like this because you've got, almost twice as much clearance between these two fans. Not quite, but that can make the difference between working and not working. In fact, I think because of my power supply clearance here, I'm just going to go ahead and use the slimmer Noctuas just to try to help make sure that the power supply cables don't get in the way. So again, my recommendation, SFXL, not ATX, but it's a weird global situation we're in. If you do elect to use the Noctua fans with a radiator, be mindful of the length of your screw. If you over tighten the screw, you can tighten it into your radiator and puncture it. So make sure that you don't do that. You can go to the hardware store. This is not that atypical of a screw size. You go to your local hardware store and get one that's the appropriate length, or use a bunch of washers. GPUs, okay. So I've got a 6800 XT and a 3090 and a 2080 Super from MSI. And believe it or not, the 2080 Super from MSI is actually bigger than the 3090. And this is gonna be the case with some of the aftermarket 3090s as well. So I thought we could just take a quick look at how each of these graphics cards actually fit in here. Oh, and also I'll mention the power supply. This is one of the reasons that the Meshlicious I think is pretty good if you are gonna go the ridiculous build, because a 750 watt power supply, even with this i5, even if you go with a really low power supply, ain't gonna cut it. You need an 850 or greater. And that's just, that's just how that graphics card is. It's real bursty in terms of the power that it needs. I'm trying to see if a 3090 will fit in this impossibly tiny case, and it will! So if you look closely on the inside here, the circuit board where the PCIe slot is has multiple sets of holes. So you can move that printed circuit board closer or farther away from the outside of the case. As it is, it's pretty much perfect for a 3090. There's a little bit of extra room at the back. You'll have to put this end of the card in first, but there's just barely enough room for connectors. The first DisplayPort slot is a little blocked by the peg that stands up here, but you could unscrew that and put it somewhere else. See the silver post? It's gonna block that first DisplayPort slot, but that's okay. You can move the post and unscrew it. It's not riveted in or anything like that. So if you were an absolute mad lad and you were gonna run a 3090 in this system, you totally could do it. I'm not going to run a 3090 in this system. You've even got enough room here with the radiator for the power thing to break out. I'm not actually gonna do that though. It is a little bit of a tight fit with the tubes from the radiator. I definitely would not have been able to use a normal size fan. At a 280 millimeter AIO, forget it. So if the regular 3090 works, the larger 2080 Super is going to be a little bit more of a problem, right? Well, the 2080 Super is just a little longer. It's not quite as tall. You could probably make the 2080 Super, the 2070 Super work, but you would have to move the posts and the printed circuit board, and then you're going to have a little less room to get your connectors in here. Fortunately, in the case, they do bundle a right angle HDMI cable, which will let you get just a few more millimeters of clearance, but you know, beware that a 3090 is just the right length. You could go a little longer, but the 2080 Super, you'd have to actually move the printed circuit board, and that's gonna crowd your connectors on this end, which could still work. It's just gonna be a little bit more fiddly, a little bit more tedious. Here we've got our reference 6800 XT. This is the smallest one of the bunch. And of course that one just drops right in like a glove. It fits great, it works great. It's really the best setup because it's not, you know, a huge bulbous card. One thing that I don't like about the airflow is that the way that I've got the fans configured, I'm drawing air in from the front and exhausting it back here. And I've also got the video card exhausting air this way. So we have a lot of hot air coming into this way and these fans are kind of fighting each other. I'm hoping that that will mean that the air will exhaust out the side, but it might have been better to flip these fans around the other way so that it's drawing air in from the inside of the case and pushing it through the radiator to the outside. Of course, that's gonna pick up some of the heat from the GPU. Not great, but you know, it's a small form factor system. And just to give you an idea, if you were gonna mount the GPU the other way, you know, our 6700 XT is much too long to mount it the other way, even if the radiator weren't in the way. But if you could mount the GPU this way, look at how much more room you'd have. It's a lot of room. This is a regular blower style 2080. And as you can see, you know, it's only a 2-slot card, plenty of room. This is gonna be the loudest card of the bunch, but you know, there's ample room for normal sized GPUs, no problem. Storage. I gotta put my SSD assembly back in there. I'm actually gonna use the Kioxia BG4 micro SD. The reason for this is because I need a little bit more physical room inside the case for a mod. And so this is 1 terabyte, the size of a postage stamp, which is kind of bananas. And the performance is pretty reasonable too. For memory, I've got some nice ADATA XPG, you know, gaming D10. Now one thing to note, when we're talking about the 3090, the Founders 3090, or even a reference blower card, it means that you're sort of blowing hot air down to the bottom of the case. The 3090 does the same thing. A lot of GPUs will exhaust some of their heat out the back. You know, this configuration, your radial fans, doesn't really move a ton of air out the back. But, you know, your 3090, this is a hairdryer's worth of heat coming out here. This is a lot of heat. And so you're gonna have to keep an eye on your build and your temperatures, because with the GPU pointing down, it's maybe not ideal for thermals. We'll see. I've temporarily put the 5700 in here, 5700 XT, because the 5700 XT was kind of a first gen PCI Express 4 device, and it's very picky about PCI Express 4. So I'm gonna test the riser cable and see how that goes before I finish up this build. Because ultimately this build may end up with a PCIe 3 graphics card if the PCIe 4 doesn't work correctly. It is bundled with a right angle HDMI cable, because even if you move the GPU up all the way, depending on what your particular GPU is, there may still not really be enough room at the bottom to tuck in that cable. And me personally, I'd rather just slide the GPU a little bit closer so that I'll get a little bit more room for bigger GPUs. So probably just gonna 3D print a little skirt for this to lift it up a little bit and give the connectors coming out of the bottom a little bit more clearance, rather than use the bundled right angle HDMI cable. Well, I just got back from testing and color me impressed. The riser cable works fine at PCI Express 4 with one of the most temperamental cards for PCI Express 4 that I have. Incredible. The Meshlicious team has done a good job. I was not expecting that. I was expecting to have to run the GPU at PCI Express 3 speeds, but whatever they've done with this riser assembly, it works great. Kudos, very good job. So I think that means we're pretty much ready to button this build up. You know, I gotta be honest, I wasn't sure what to expect from this, this design and implementation team. You know, the form factor here, you know, you got some options. One of the bigger drawbacks is the GPU placement and the airflow and the fans coming out the bottom, but I feel like I could 3D print some lifter feet to give myself a little bit more clearance, or maybe even some feet to use it in an alternative orientation, something like this. I mean, don't you think a compact desktop like this, you know, put your monitor up here, assuming that it can breathe around your monitor, something like that could work, and then you know, you connect your display on the side. I mean, it'd probably be all right like that. But as it is, you know, we've got the Asus Strix I/O on the back here, and we've got Thunderbolt. Gonna be testing out that Thunderbolt 4 connection here in a little bit. RGB on our analog 3.5mm audio jacks, because of course, Asus, of course there's going to be RGB in the audio jacks. But I've got an extra M.2 slot that's free, so I could break that out into maybe another PCI Express by 4 slot. I actually do have a little bit of room to move around in here. It's a pretty neat little build. I really like how it turned out overall. You know, even under full load, it's not exactly whisper quiet, but that's really down to the components that I've chosen. If I want a quieter system, I could go with higher end Noctua fans, a little different setup, and certainly a different GPU. But it's surprisingly quiet. And that may be because it breathes well, because it's all mesh. The power light and the hard drive light are actually sort of recessed inside the USB 3 connector, and you can kind of see it through a tiny pinhole in the power button as well. We got one USB 3 and one USB Type-C, but that's gonna be it for this build. This is a quick look at the Meshlicious. I like it. I like the configurability. I like the flexibility. I don't think I would have built it a different way. If you like this video, you know what to do, or if you didn't like it, you know, you definitely complain in the forum like everybody else. It's fine. It's fine. I'm signing out, and I'll see you in the Level 1 forums.